The silence had settled over the Brennan household like winter snow that never melts. Richard Brennan stood at his daughter's bedside watching 8-year-old Emily stare out the window at nothing in particular. 3 months had passed since the accident and the doctors had done everything they could for her broken bones and bruised body. But the words that once flowed from Emily like a bubbling creek had simply stopped. The physical trauma has healed, Dr. Patricia Wells had explained gently, but sometimes the mind needs more time. Richard had built his technology company from nothing, working 18-hour days and missing too many bedtime stories. Now all the success in the world felt meaningless without hearing his little girl's laughter echoing through their home. He had hired the best speech therapists money could buy. Specialists flew in from Boston and New York with their degrees and expensive equipment. They tried everything from computer programs to music therapy, but Emily remained locked in her silent world. At Brennan Technologies, the employees whispered in the hallways about their CEO's struggles. They had never seen Richard so broken, so desperate. One morning in late November, Richard gathered his entire staff in the main conference room. His voice shook as he spoke to the 100 faces looking back at him. "If anyone can help my daughter speak again," he said, fighting back tears, "I'll give them everything I own. The company, the house, everything." The room fell silent. Most employees looked down at their hands, knowing there was nothing they could offer. But in the back corner, an older man named Thomas Murphy quietly raised his weathered hand. Thomas had worked as the night janitor at Brennan Technologies for 15 years. His silver hair was always neatly combed and his blue maintenance uniform was pressed and clean. People knew him as the friendly man who hummed old Irish songs while mopping floors. "Mr. Brennan," Thomas said in his gentle voice, "I'd like to try if you'll let me." The room buzzed with surprised murmurs. Richard looked puzzled but nodded. That evening Thomas arrived at the Brennan mansion carrying a small wooden toolbox and wearing his best Sunday clothes. Richard's wife Catherine met him at the door. She had grown thin with worry and her once bright eyes were clouded with grief. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Thomas kindly, "We've tried so many professionals." Thomas smiled and his eyes crinkled at the corners. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, "sometimes the best medicine doesn't come from books." Emily sat in her bedroom surrounded by expensive toys and educational games that lay untouched. When Thomas knocked softly and entered, she looked up with curious eyes. "Hello, the little miss," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "My name is Thomas, but my grandchildren call me Grandpa Tom." He opened his wooden toolbox and Emily leaned forward slightly. Inside were not medical instruments or therapy tools but simple treasures. A smooth river stone, a wooden whistle carved by hand, a small leather journal filled with hand-drawn pictures. "I brought some things to show you," Thomas said, "things that helped me when I couldn't find my words either." Emily tilted her head and for the first time in months showed genuine interest. Thomas pulled out the river stone. "This came from a creek behind my childhood home in County Cork," he said. "When I was about your age I was so shy I could barely speak to anyone." He placed the stone in Emily's small palm. "My grandmother told me that this stone had listened to the water singing for 100 years," he continued. "She said if I held it tight enough it might teach me how to find my own song." Emily's fingers closed around the stone. Over the next several evenings Thomas returned. He never pushed Emily to speak or brought complicated exercises. Instead he told her stories about his life, about coming to America as a young man with nothing but hope in his heart, about meeting his wife Mary at a church dance and being too nervous to ask her to dance, about their 3 children and how each one taught him something new about love. "Words are like seeds," he told Emily one evening as they looked out at the frost-covered garden. "Sometimes they need to rest in the dark soil of our hearts before they're ready to grow." Thomas showed her his hand-carved whistle. "My father made this for me when I was 7, he said. He told me that music was just another way of speaking when regular words weren't enough." He played a gentle Irish melody and Emily's eyes grew bright with tears. On the 7th evening Thomas brought out his leather journal. "These are pictures I drew for my grandchildren," he said. "When they were little like you they loved hearing stories, but sometimes I drew pictures instead of using words. The pages were filled with simple beautiful drawings of trees and animals and families holding hands. Emily reached out and touched a drawing of a little girl sitting by a window. "That's my granddaughter Sarah," Thomas said. "She used to sit by her window after her parents divorced, waiting for her daddy to come visit." He turned the page to show Sarah playing in a garden with a big smile. "But you know what she learned," Thomas continued. "Sometimes the love we're waiting for is already all around us. We just have to learn how to see it again." That night Emily slept holding the river stone. The next evening when Thomas arrived, Emily was sitting up in bed with the journal open on her lap. "Grandpa Tom," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, but he simply smiled and sat down as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Yes, little miss. Tell me about the tree," she said, pointing to one of his drawings. Her voice was rusty from months of silence, but it was the most beautiful sound Thomas had ever heard. Over the following weeks Emily's words returned slowly like spring flowers pushing through winter soil. She started with single words, then simple sentences. Thomas visited every evening, bringing new stories and patient encouragement. Richard and Catherine watched in amazement as their daughter began to heal, not through expensive treatments or complicated therapies, but through the gentle presence of a man who understood that healing happens in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. "How did you know?" Catherine asked Thomas one evening as they watched Emily playing in the garden through the window. "How did you know what she needed?" Thomas smiled and thought of his own grandmother who had held him when words wouldn't come. "My grandmother used to say that broken hearts recognize each other," he said. "I think maybe Emily just needed to know that someone understood what it felt like to lose their voice." When Emily was finally speaking in full sentences again, Richard called Thomas into his office. "You did what no one else could do," Richard said. "I meant what I said about giving you everything." Thomas shook his head gently. "Mr. Brennan, I don't need your company or your house," he said, "but I do have one request." Richard leaned forward eagerly. "I'd like you to start a program here at the company," Thomas said, "something to help other families who are struggling. We could call it the Listening Hearts Foundation." And so they did. The foundation paired employees who had overcome difficult experiences with families who needed support. Not professional therapists, but regular people who understood that sometimes healing comes through simple human connection. Richard discovered that success meant more than quarterly profits. Catherine found purpose in coordinating volunteers. Emily grew up to become a teacher working with children who had trouble finding their words. And Thomas continued working as the night janitor at Brennan Technologies. But now everyone knew that the man who hummed Irish songs while mopping floors carried wisdom that no degree could teach. On quiet evenings Thomas would sit with Emily, now grown and married with children of her own. They would look through the old leather journal and remember the night when a river stone and a patient heart helped a little girl find her voice again. Words are powerful things, Emily would tell her own children, but sometimes the most important conversations happen in the spaces between the words. And in those spaces love grows.